And just want to remind everybody to keep your mics muted and we'll get started. Good evening and welcome to tonight's program, Once they're gone for good. Indigenous shell heaps, climate change, and confronting heritage loss through citizen science with Dr. Bonnie Newsom and Dr. Alice Kelley. I'm Brenda Harrington, Program Librarian at the Belfast Free Library. Thank you all for joining us. The Belfast Free Library has been pleased to co-sponsor the September through May series of evening programs with the Belfast Bay Watershed Coalition. This was our second year continuing to offer the BBWC programs on Zoom, and it's been a great collaboration for both of us. So I want to extend a big thank you to BBWC for all that they do. Before I turn the mic over to Tom King, the board member from the BBWC, for updates and to introduce tonight's speakers, I want to mention that this program is part of the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues, or ABCD, which is a multi-year grant-funded project of the Belfast Free Library created to help all residents in our area learn about and talk about climate change impacts in order to work together to prepare for the challenges ahead. I invite you to go to our website, belfastlibrary.org, and follow the link at the top of the page to all of Belfast Climate Dialogues to learn more, to view past programs, and learn about future events, and even sign up for our newsletter. During tonight's program, we ask that you put questions in the chat for the Q&A at the end, and please remember to keep your mics muted. A recording of the program will be added to the library's YouTube channel. And I think with all of that, I'm gonna be ready to turn it over to Tom King. It's all yours, Tom.
Thank you, Brenda, and thank you again and the Belfast Free Library for co-hosting these programs from September to May with the Belfast Bay Watershed Coalition. I think we're in for a real special treat tonight. Both of these ladies have their PhD and they've worked in the Maine, Climate Institute for, a number of years. And Bonnie, as a matter of fact, is part of the Penobscot Indian Nation. So, I mean, how much more, ingrained is she into our world, our natural world than that? And Alice has been here since 1981, working in the Maine system, the University of Maine system. So I think they're going to give us a really good explanation of what we really have and what we don't know that we have in our past about, the whole cultural and what climate change is doing to us now. So with this, and before I let them talk, I just want to bring up a few things that Belfast Bay Watershed Coalition is still involved with. We're doing a bird walk tomorrow. If you're up at 7 in the morning, the Hills to Sea Trail bird walk is going to happen. Meet at City Point at the railroad station there where the takeoff is for the Hills to Sea Trail at 7, and there'll be a bird walk. It'll be a bird walk Saturday on the Upper Mason Pond. So that's right off 141, and you can park right there in the parking lot there. That will actually be, I shouldn't say a walk. You better bring a canoe and a kayak, okay? It's gonna be hard to walk on water, okay? So we also do have, on June 11th, we're gonna have a paddle the Goose River. And it's either a 4-mile or 7-mile paddle. We have 2 different spots where you can take out. So it's up to you if you want to come and meet at the Swanville General Store at the dam there. And that's the put-in point for that. And any of these, events can be found on our website, BBWC website, and you'll be able to find that and more. But that's sort of the wrap up from BBWC. We will be doing things through the summer, so just keep looking on our website for events and we'll keep you posted. with that, I want to turn it over to Bonnie and Allison. I want to thank them both for their presentation tonight.
Thank you, Tom. In Penobscot, we would say Chi Williwan, great thanks. And I'm really thrilled to be here tonight. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Does that look okay to everybody? Thumbs
Yep.
up? Okay, very good. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I want to start tonight's presentation with the University of Maine's Indigenous Land Acknowledgement. Dr. Kelley and I really consider it a privilege to engage with Indigenous heritage sites through our work, and the land acknowledgement articulates the really deep and important connections between the Indigenous peoples of Maine and the places we all live and work together today. This is University of Maine's land acknowledgement, and it says the University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. So with that as a backdrop to our talk tonight, Dr. Kelley and I are going to tag team our presentation. I'll begin with a general overview of archaeological shell heaps and highlight their research, social, and cultural values. Then Dr. Kelley will discuss some of the current threats to coastal sites and share with you details on our Midden Minders initiative, which is a citizen science strategy for documenting and monitoring the erosion of archaeological shell heaps in Maine. So the Indigenous peoples of Maine have really a 12,000 plus history here, and much of that record, the record of that history is encapsulated in subsurface spaces. We also know that some of that record is encapsulated in oral narratives, intergenerational memory, and petroglyph sites. The image on the left is an artist's rendition of Glooskap. And Glooskap is an Indigenous culture hero who's said to be responsible for the creation of people by shooting an arrow into an ash tree from which people emerged. He's also responsible for many of the geologic features we see around Maine. For example, in Penobscot Bay, there's a quartz vein near Castine, and that's supposedly the result of Glooskap killing a moose and throwing the entrails across the bay. Other features such as the Penobscot River and Mount Kineo are also connected to Glooskap's activities. Glooskap helped shape the Maine we see today, and as such, oral narratives such as this are a source of information for understanding Indigenous peoples' worldviews and lifeways. Another way that we can gain insight into Indigenous worldviews is through art. In the center is a photo of petroglyphs from Machias Bay. These are images pecked into stone outcrops, and they're also a way to convey information. Petroglyph images occur all over the state, and oftentimes you hear that there's no written record for Native peoples prior to European contact. But in reality, these are records that tell stories and histories. In Machias Bay, for example, there's a petroglyph of a ship on one of the outcrops there. And so that tells us something about people's interactions with large sailing ships that came to North America. And finally, the image on the right is a picture of archaeological excavations at a site in Eddington, Maine. And places such as this also preserve Indigenous pasts. These are really another type of narrative for understanding the lives of people living here before European contact. Here in Maine, we also have coastal archaeological sites, which take the form of shell heaps oftentimes, and sometimes these are referred to as mounds or middens. And these are really important repositories of Indigenous heritage, and they're also very fragile cultural and historic spaces. Shell heaps are human-generated accumulations of shells, where in the past, people harvesting shellfish would deposit the shells at locations along the coast. The image on the left is from the 19th century excavations at one of the large shell heaps on the Damariscotta River. And the image on the right is another shell heap in that same vicinity, but as you can see, it's not quite as prominent. Shell heaps are not unique to Maine. They occur all over the world in both coastal and riverine settings. Here in Maine, they appear to be restricted to coastal areas. Most Maine shell heaps document roughly the last 3,000 years of Wabanaki lifeways. However, there are a few that date to 5,000 years, maybe 6,000 years old. And we also have some post-European contact shell heaps, although these are also less common. In some places in North America, shell heaps are interpreted as mounds or monuments. For example, in the southeastern United States, starting around 6,000 years ago, people created large shell mounds along rivers, and subsequently they constructed what's referred to as coastal shell rings. These large shell mounds, what they do is they surround open centers, and they're found in Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. Debates by archaeologists about these features are ongoing, and it's really unclear if they were simply a byproduct of depositing shell while living in circular villages, or if they were deliberately constructed as monuments. The image on the left is a 3D representation of the Fig Island shell rings in South Carolina, and these sites are actually on the National Register of Historic Places. Excavations here really have produced a lot of evidence of people living on the rings. And there's been some indication that the shells were deposited rapidly, suggesting deliberate construction. The image on the right shows the various shapes of shell rings in the Southeast. And you can see that Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia all have these Indigenous features on the landscape. Here in Maine, we're really just beginning to explore the possibility of shell heaps here being deliberate constructions or having some monument-like social role. In Maine, people constructed shell mounds using soft shell clams or oyster shells. Clam is the most common. These deposits can range from less than a meter to multiple meters thick. The term midden has become really a catch-all term for these spaces that by definition suggests garbaging behavior. And I think this is a misnomer in many cases, because we know that shell heaps can be very prominent and visible features on the landscape and may have been intentional landmark constructions. In my opinion, to reduce these to cultural spaces to trash dump status really underappreciates the full breadth of their role in Wabanaki lifeways. We know that shell heap sites are complex stratigraphically and often reflect dynamic cultural spaces in which human activity changes over time and space. It's not uncommon to find shell-free layers within these sites, and this may be evidence of site abandonment or alternate uses of the location. You can see an example here of a shell heap with very thick midden deposits right here, as well as one that has a simple thin shell layer. Occasionally, archaeologists also encounter house floors, hearth features, human mortuary features, and we've even found dog burials at shell-bearing archaeological sites. There are roughly 2,000 shell heaps present on the coast of Maine, and they vary in size and settings. On one end of the spectrum, we have the very large oyster shell heaps on the Damariscotta River, and the Glidden Midden seen here is the largest shell mound in the Northeast. On the opposing riverbank, Native peoples constructed an equally large mound, and it's referred to as the Whaleback Midden. And this site was decimated in the 1800s by commercial mining activities linked to extracting shell for chicken feed supplement and road fill. I think it's really important to point out that the Glidden Midden remains a prominent feature on the landscape, largely due to landowner protections of the site and subsequent conservation efforts. Other shell heaps, such as the one shown here in Washington County on Sips Bay, are not as prominent. These smaller shell heaps may be remnants of once larger sites that are mostly gone now, or they may reflect short-term occupation or use of the site by smaller numbers of families. Many, like the two on the bottom here, are located in exposed areas along the coast, making them quite vulnerable to both human and natural impacts. Perhaps one of the most notable characteristics of shell heaps is their preservation of varied data sets. Because shells act as a preservation agent by reducing the acidity in the soil, these sites preserve artifacts and ecofacts generally not found on interior or other types of sites. Some examples of the types of materials that are commonly recovered from shell heaps are shown here. Organics, such as plant remains, bone, and even bone tools, and shell can be radiocarbon dating and can inform our reconstructions of past environments. They can also help us determine seasonal use of the site by families, what folks relied on for food resources. And they can broaden our understanding of Indigenous ideologies and people's relationships to other species. Cultural material recovered from shell heaps include stone tools, pottery, bone tools, and these provide a window into people's philosophies around materiality. We can examine how their material culture changed through time, and we can learn about their discard and recycling practices and reflect on how they may differ from our own. Good preservation also allows us to explore past technologies and identify areas of sophistication. And this really helps to deconstruct notions of primitiveness or evolutionary inferiority, which in the past was a common archaeological interpretation of Indigenous peoples. On this slide, we have some examples of Maine sites, of items from Maine sites. This is, of course, projectile points or arrow or spear points. And you can see how the materials change through time, and material types actually change as well. This slide shows, or this image shows, Indigenous ceramics, and these also change in time, just like our houses and cars change through time. Past people's Indigenous ceramic styles change through time, and we can tell how old it is because we know what styles were when. Also, because of good organic preservation, we recover items such as these shell beads, and this is actually a bird bone flute that was recovered at Acadia National Park. So bone and shell do not preserve well in sites on Maine's interior, so we wouldn't have access to any of these items without shell heaps. And some of these date to probably 3,000 years old or older. Shell heaps also preserve cultural features, and these are remnants of past human activity. But unlike artifacts, you can't simply take them back to the lab to analyze. On the left, we have a fire hearth here, and these are excellent for providing charcoal for radiocarbon dating. And on the right, we have this dark stain here, and this may be indicative of some sort of activity, maybe remnants of a burning or animal processing. Shell heaps can contribute significantly to reconstructions of past environments. They can also contribute to understanding food choices and seasonality. For example, they help us they can help us understand changes in ocean temperatures by the presence or absence of certain species. These images on the left include shell here, otoliths, which are the ear bones of fish. And this here is a swordfish rostrum. And each of these swordfish were in Maine roughly 5,000 years ago. And we know because they were in Maine, and we have evidence of them in archaeological sites, that sea surface temperatures or ocean temperatures in generally were probably warmer. The images on the upper right include this copper nugget, likely from a source in Nova Scotia. And this is a fish hook or some sort of small harpoon kind of thing. These can tell us about past travel and technologies. And the two images on the bottom are cultural features, and the one on the left is a standing stone feature, and we're really unsure of its function. But it certainly does not belong there. And so that's how we know it's an archaeological or human generated kind of feature. The one on the right is interpreted as part of a house floor. And so you can begin to look at people's domestic space. Shell mound sites are some of the only places that we can acquire data on extinct species, such as the sea mink and great auk, both of which were hunted to extinction. These are 3 sea mink jawbones that were found clustered together at a site in Machias Bay. I'm not sure why they were all together. There's been some interpretation of potential inclusion in a medicine bag. And these kinds of discoveries inform our understanding of the relationship between Wabanaki peoples and various mammals, bird, fish, and reptile species. In addition to being important repositories of scientific and anthropological information, shell heaps carry important heritage and social values as well. Most shell heaps in Maine record past Indigenous lifeways, and as such are really important and irreplaceable heritage resources for Maine's Indigenous communities. Once they're gone for good. We can't get them back. And there are 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine: the Micmac, Maliseet, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot. And collectively, we refer to ourselves as the Wabanaki, or the people of first light. And although the Maine tribal nations have done really well to maintain many distinct cultural characteristics, connectedness to tribal histories and practices was disrupted through efforts of assimilation, disease, acts of violence, and religious conversion during the period of European contact. We no longer have access to the same cultural spaces as our ancestors because land ownership has changed. And so shell heap research and preservation efforts that are consistent with tribal agendas help Indigenous communities maintain culturally distinct practices and identities, and enable us to draw from past lifeways that enrich our communities, educate our young people, and sustain our identities. Research and preservation and documentation of shell heaps in collaboration with Indigenous communities is one way to reconcile some of these effects of colonizations on Maine's Indigenous populations. Not all shell heaps are Indigenous spaces exclusively. Colonial heritage is represented in them as well. The Holmes Point West site in Machias Bay produced both Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultural materials. For example, this Saint Ange pot was recovered during a University of Maine field school in Machias, and it's French in origin and likely dates to somewhere between 1610 and 1675. This is an English chamber pot here. It dates to the early to mid 1700s. This was also recovered from the same site as the French pot. And this figurine in the center here is from Malaga Island, which is a shell heap site generated by a mixed race fishing community that lived at Malaga Island between the 1800s, mid 1800s to 1912. So these diverse cultural representations at these sites make them extremely important in understanding past cross-cultural relations, trade, land encroachment and alienation, or shared use of space, which we think we might see some of that going on in Machias Bay. So the Belfast Bay area has produced archaeological evidence of Indigenous occupation dating back potentially to before 8,000 years ago. Local surface finds reported to the Maine Historic Preservation Commission include this point here, which has flaking characteristics reminiscent of some of the oldest Indigenous technology in Maine. As you can see by this site map here, Belfast Bay has a number of sites listed in the Maine site records. However, erosion has taken its toll on many of these sites. In fact, some survey records from the 80s and 90s note potential for destruction within the decade due to erosion. So they are probably gone now. Moving out geographically, there's well-documented evidence of Indigenous use of Sears Island. The Belfast Free Library actually has an online presentation by Paul Bach on the archaeology of Sears Island, and research there suggests that evidence of Native American use of the island goes back 4,000 years. So the region has a rich, very rich, but fragile record of Indigenous lifeways. For Maine's Indigenous peoples, shell heaps are remnants of our built heritage. Indigenous histories are generally not well represented in Maine's heritage conversations. Like many Indigenous peoples across the globe, Wabanaki histories and cultural spaces tend to be marginalized and in many cases, socially invisible. Preservation and research on coastal shell heaps really helps to counteract the historic erasure of Maine's Indigenous heritage and can support educational initiatives designed around Maine's First People. So I'm going to now turn the Zoom session over to Dr. Alice Kelley, and she's going to continue the presentation talking about threats to shell heaps and the role of citizen science in shell heap documentation and preservation. Dr. Kelley?
Hi. So, hi, pleasure to be with you all. And I will share my screen if you just give me a minute. I can queue up my slides and there we go. Of course, this is in the way, so here we go. So can you all see that? Get a thumbs up? Great. All right. Well, as Dr. Newsom has told you about shell middens and their place in Indigenous history, my section is to talk about the problems that are facing shell middens. And there is a problem, and the primary problem is that they are in fact disappearing. Wave erosion, bank slumping, development, and looting are all taking a toll on these features. Let's see, and I have to. And of course, as Dr. Newsom mentioned, as we lose middens or shell heaps, we lose Indigenous cultural heritage, part of Maine history as well, the evidence of past lifeways, evidence of past environments, and really a sense of place for our Maine inhabitants. So looking at the issues that face shell heaps, we can group them into two general groups. One of them are climate change, and we can call them natural in that they're happening in the natural world, but they're certainly part of human impact on our planet. And these are primarily wave erosion and bank slumping, but I will talk in a few minutes, I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. And then, of course, we have direct human activity, which is through development and looting. Some people call this collecting, and it really boils down to looting of sites. So mining, we mentioned the mining of the Whaleback Midden and Damerscotta. And that happened not just at the Whaleback, but actually almost completely removed the shell mound. If you go to Damerscotta today and you go to the Whaleback Historic Site, what you're really looking at is the area from which most of those shells were removed. You can still see a little bit of the original deposit, which was under the buildings, but that was almost entirely removed. But it wasn't the only one that was mined. These were used again for chicken feed, often for sweetening the soil, creating lime. And so while natural causes have removed shell middens, people certainly had a hand in it for economic reasons. And then, of course, there is development on the coast. As Maine's coast became a favorite place to live, people are building buildings. And if a shell midden happens to be on private property, is not being developed with federal or state funds, there are really no preservation laws in place. If you show an image here taken in 2005, you're looking at those roofs in the forefront are condominiums that were built on what was a shell midden and might have been a rather old and very archaeologically significant one in southern Maine. And so we really have no protection for these features, either by developing or people collecting material, except by landowner trespass. If the landowner is not happy with what's going on, they can prosecute through trespass laws, but that is the only protection we have for these features. Now, climate change is also a major, oh, excuse me, they didn't mean to jump ahead. Climate change is also a major feature. These graphs represent sea level rise along the coast of Maine, and the blue line is a long trend from the early 1900s through to 2020. But if you look at the shorter term trend, which is shown in the red line on the right-hand side of each of the graphs, the one to the left being the Portland Tide Station and the one to the right being at Bar Harbor, you can see that that red trend line shows an increasing rate of sea level rise. When I started teaching at the University of Maine, I would tell my intro geology students that sea level rise along the Maine coast was 1 to 2 millimeters per year. The last class I taught, I was telling the students that it's 3 millimeters a year. Now, a millimeter is very small, but it is a relentless rise. And if we look at projections, we're seeing that sea level is projected to rise at an even greater rate. And of course, this is through as a result of the melting of land-based glaciers and also the warming and expansion of the water in the ocean. And in the Maine's Climate Council 2020 report, I wanted to put here that the authors feel it is imperative to note that water levels have continued to run high at Eastport, Bar Harbor, and the Portland tide gauge. And although it wasn't counted in that, able to be included in the report, these are among the top highest rise in sea level ever recorded at each of these tide gauges. And so it's accelerated to 3 millimeters per year and is expected to rise faster as global climate continues to warm. So the impacts that we're seeing as a result of sea level rise, which I'll talk about in a minute, are going to be even more pronounced in the future than they are today. And we know that we are losing these sites at present. So climate change impacts or climate change induced sea level rise raises the level of daily wave action, as well as the ice erosion that we see in the winter as blocks of ice move up and down next to that next to the bluffs that support these middens. We also know that it raises the level of storms. So storm waves can reach increasingly higher and higher. And with this, the effects of climate change, we're seeing more storms and more intense storms. So this is even bringing more impact onto these areas. With climate change also comes warming, more cases of warming during the winter. And I think we've all noted this. The January thaw is legendary in Maine, but we've had 2 or more January thaws followed by a February thaw. And if you think back, you can remember that we had some warm periods, and then often those warm periods were followed by intense rainstorms. Well, as we have this freezing and thawing of the midden material, or the shell pieces in the shell mounds, we have an expansion of water as it freezes, and then contraction as it melts. And as we have this continuing freeze-thaw action, we're working that material up and down and farther apart. While this doesn't lead to a great deal of material coming off, some is washed down as the rain washes through or groundwater comes through, but it also softens up that material and makes it more amenable to erosion as those increased storm waves are hitting the site. So we have all these factors coming together. With that, we see slumping. In the image here, you can see a picture of Dr. Newsom with a whole tree that has slumped down on the side of a bluff, and the top of that bluff hosts a shell mound. And so we're losing material both through active erosion, through slumping, and then through these freeze-thaw activity. And if we look at statewide annual temperatures, we can see whether you're looking at the maximum temperature, the minimum temperature, or the mean of all of them, they are in fact increasing with time. So with these impacts to shell middens, what can we do? We have over 2,000 middens, over 3,500 miles of coast, which host those middens, both on the mainland and on islands. And we have very few professional geologists practicing here in the state of Maine. So faced with this problem, Maine Sea Grant supported us to develop a meeting to try and discuss these problems. And out of that meeting came the idea for the Maine Midden Minders program, which is the citizen or community science program. So I mentioned our stakeholders meeting was the very beginning of this. It was Lost to the Sea, Maine's Ancient Coastal Heritage, funded by Maine Sea Grant. And this had a science component in which we were looking at ways to be able to characterize shell middens in a non-invasive way using geophysical techniques. But in our stakeholders meeting, which was a day of talks and presentations and discussions, accompanied with a day of field trips to the Glidden and Whaleback Middens, we included people representing the state, conservation groups, historical societies, researchers, archaeologists, tribal representatives, and avocational archaeologists to come up with some ideas of how to address this issue. And out of that meeting came the idea of bringing people who are not professional archaeologists into the study and monitoring of shell mounds. The idea of the program was to monitor and document change at shell middens or shell mounds as a way to preserving cultural and environmental information that is revealed by erosion, to help create appreciation of Maine's Indigenous culture, and to open it up to all community members. In Europe, there is more of a sense of bringing communities into participating in archaeological study of where they live. Here in North America, we've been somewhat divided into professional archaeologists and then people who are interested in archaeology but not practicing. And I think this has come out a great deal from the result of looting of archaeological sites. For a long time, people didn't really recognize what these were. They were just seen as trash dumps left behind by a primitive culture. There was really nothing more to be seen than maybe some interesting arrowheads and pieces of broken pottery. But now, as we recognize that this information is so critically important to understanding the past, really there was the thought of trying to protect it by hiding these sites somewhat, keeping them away from people and hoping that they wouldn't be dug into and material just taken away. Because of course, when you collect an arrowhead, it gives you great pleasure, but then it sits on a mantelpiece or maybe on a windowsill or a desk, and it's out of place and it can't tell its story to anyone. So with the idea that people who live in an area know where these things are, we wanted to invite community members to help preserve this information. So we started building our network by identifying partners, and our primary partners have been the Maine Indigenous peoples, the tribes, their historic preservation officers, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, and many conservation organizations. And as we're developing this, we're seeing historical societies are joining us as well. So we developed a monitoring plan. This was with the support of Maine Sea Grant and also the Senator George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine. And in our monitoring plan, we wanted to record a site description, what the site looked like at the time, what was happening, what could be observed, take some measurements to be able to document that change, and then use photography as a way to take a snapshot in time that we could hold in our database and use for comparisons as we did this over the years. So in creating a database, we have our volunteers are trained. We ask them to get property owners' permission, have a notarized letter giving them permission to be on the property. We protect the information, meaning that the minders can only access material for the site they're monitoring. This is done as a way to protect both landowner privacy and the integrity of the site. And so rather than being one of the sites like perhaps the main phenology sites where anybody can get on and get to see what's happening, this information is held so that it's protected, and someone from anywhere in the state or from away couldn't use it as a guide to looting middens. And so then access to the whole of the database or parts of the database is by permission for tribal needs for research or cultural resource management. And we've also created a website, the Maine Midden Minders website, and I will put the address there in the chat later so you can access that if you'd like to learn about middens. We have educational material on how to monitor middens, and then also all the things you would need to sign up to be a midden minder. So one of the important parts of our the information we collect are measurements. We've done this using very simple tools by creating a permanent marker at middens, usually on 10-meter increments, and then measuring at 1 meter or 2 meter increments in a perpendicular from that baseline, as we can show here in this cartoon, and measuring from the baseline to the edge of the eroding shell heap. And by doing this on an annual basis, we're able to track the rate of change. Now, this is one as an idea to understand what's happening. It's also so that we have something more than anecdotal evidence when we're trying to get some sort of funding to do some of this work. And so we've been doing this, and in the picture on the right are an image of a school group from Cobscook Institute helping us do these measurements. Ideally, we would do measurements once a year. And that's what they've been helping us do. We have one place, the Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust has now been recording data for 3 years and are planning to go out again this spring or this summer. And so we'll be getting to gain an understanding of the processes, the rates, and perhaps be able to pick the sites that are need either protected or prioritized for investigation. Photography, as I mentioned, is also a really important part, because here we can create an image of what is happening at time and how things at each site has changed. So we're photographing both the Midden condition and also any artifacts that Midden minders may find that have washed out of the shell heap. These can be faunal remains, a picture in the back, or projectile points. And I'm very happy to say that projectile point image was donated to us by a 12-year-old who came on one of our field trips and very proudly showed us that piece and helped us document where it was from and include that image in our database. We've started a while ago. 2016 was our first meeting. We were just really getting underway with our field program when COVID hit. And so we're doing a little bit of rebuilding at this point. But here are some of the groups that have or are planning to cooperate with us. We're very happy and honored to have the interest and support of the Wabanaki tribes in Maine, and also a number of conservation groups and historical societies, and the Maine Island Trail Association, who is planning to train their volunteers to take pictures of island bins to help document what are happening to these shell heaps on the islands. So what are the preliminary results of our effort? Well, public education is one big part, and you are part of that tonight, coming to hear about shell mounds and how important they are. And we also lead field trips. Here we have an image of me leading a field trip, and you'll notice everyone is bundled up. Even with a really rainy day, we had almost 40 people turn out on North Haven Island for a talk and a field trip. We're also trying a few different techniques. One is the application of using drone surveys. This is being done in cooperation with Kristen Schild, or Dr. Kristen Schild at the University of Maine, and her UMaine Geomatics class. And what we're doing is creating 3D images of the shell heaps. These have been done with careful surveying, kinematic GPS base station, and surveying of ground control points, and then flying the drone to create this 3D model, which can then be used as the base for sequential flights where we can track change at these larger sites, which are really a bit harder to monitor with volunteers on the ground. And as a result, we're beginning to understand some of the erosion processes that are taking place. The impact of storms, when these storms are hitting, we're watching weather reports. We have some volunteers who go out and take pictures after a storm to really get an idea of what is really affecting each of these middens. And with that, I'd like to invite you all to consider joining our effort and being a Midden minder. And there is our website and our email address. And I'd also like to thank all of the various groups that have supported us. And so with that, I'll stop sharing. And Brenda, do you want to?
Yep. Well, I was hoping there'd be some really good questions in the chat, but I think people were so interested for the presentation. There aren't any, so perhaps you can either put your question in the chat or feel free to raise your hand if you can figure out how to do that on the Zoom. Raise your hand, not raise your hand, or just unmute yourself and ask a question. How about that? Does anybody have a question? Oh, Margot, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, Margot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. And thank you, Dr. Newsom, for your land acknowledgement at the beginning and for all the information that you both shared and for the work that you're doing. One thing that you said, Dr. Newsom, I was wondering if you could, either of you could say more about was, it sounded like you said the shell rings in the South were more understood or had been studied longer. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and perhaps maybe why that might be.
Sure. I think the interest in the shell heaps or the shell rings in the Southeast have drawn more archaeological attention, and Maine is a place where we don't have a lot of archaeologists. There are only a handful of us. And the history of Maine archaeology has been really heavily focused on a few things. It's focused on, though early on, it was focused on those sites that are referred to as the red paint people sites. There was a lot of effort in the 1920s to, excavate these sites that were grave lots with beautiful artifacts. And then as over time, different research questions drove what archaeologists focused on. And there's also this concept of, or this law called Cultural Resources Management, and it's a federal law under the National Historic Preservation Act that drives some of the archaeological research. And a lot of the work on our rivers, a lot of the archaeological work there was inspired by cultural resources management work and relicensing of the dams. And so there's been quite a bit of shell heap work in Maine, but it hasn't been the sole focus of our archaeologists. And it also hasn't, we haven't been doing enough of it to kind of move the needle in terms of understanding whether or not they're monuments. We don't even know if we have shell rings, honestly, because we just haven't done the work. So I think, it's just different research agendas, perhaps. Alice, you can feel free to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I think there's another side of that. And the coastal setting is very different in the Southeast than here. And our shell heaps are often located right on the coast. We have a very active stormy coast where erosion has really removed a lot of that material. And so they're really not that well exposed, and I think heavily eroded. The only ones that I think really have maintained their original shape is the Glidden Midden in Damariscotta, because that's on a estuary where it hasn't really experienced as much erosion. And so there you still see a really large mound with a big embankment that's very striking. And so if you put that mound on the coast and removed a great deal of it as a result of erosion, you wouldn't really get a sense of a shape. So I think that we've lost a lot of that, which means that perhaps they weren't as striking or as interesting. And then there was also the idea of that it's only a dump anyway.
All right, well, thank you. While you were talking, we got some questions in the chat. So Chloe asks, when it looks like a shell heap is about to be inundated, will you go dig it up for the artifacts before they are lost forever?
That's a really great question. And I think there are two things. One of the things that I like to do as an archaeologist is identify those places that are most vulnerable and do archaeological research at those locations. And so down East Maine is getting hit pretty hard in terms of some of the archaeological sites. And so Machias Bay has been a focus of that. It's a really tough balance because as archaeologists, we like to leave part of the site for future generations because technology and tools for studying these places will be more sophisticated than what we have today. So I think we also have issues around curation and, who's going to care for those collections long term. And so I think the question is a good one. And we don't, just because the site is eroding, we don't go and excavate it, in part because of resources. It's just lots of reasons why we don't. But part of the benefits of a Midden Minders initiative or pulling in these data, we can begin to prioritize which ones are most threatened, which ones may tell important stories, which ones are oldest that we may not be able to get information from in any of the others. So that's all of this, it's a matrix of sort in terms of trying to figure out how to approach eroding middens.
Okay, thank you. So I have another question. Can you connect tribes to the individual sites? I guess is probably the question, to the individual middens, like tribal specific tribes.
Contemporary. So Wabanaki people consider themselves descendant of all Indigenous peoples who lived in Maine prior to European contact. And part of the rationale for that, or part of the reason for that, is because I kind of go back to the Gluskab story, and people were created here. We don't have a lot of migration stories that tell us that people came from elsewhere. And so with that kind of as a foundation, we view ourselves connected to people living in Maine into deep time. And we view that connection collectively as Wabanaki people. And I think, but as we begin to explore more at certain sites, for example, the site that I have students working on next week, in fact, in Machias Bay, is right next to Passamaquoddy petroglyphs, and the Passamaquoddies take a very culturally connected view of those petroglyphs and the site as part of theirs. And we know that site had both Indigenous and European folks living at it. And so there might have been some cultural contact. So I think that's a good example of some close connections between contemporary Wabanaki peoples and old archaeological sites.
All right, thank you for your answer. There isn't another question in the chat, but I have a question. When you're evaluating and measuring the various sites every year, I think you said you did it every year. Is there a certain time of the year that you do it, or like in the summer, in the fall, or obviously maybe not the winter? I was just wondering that.
Actually, the spring or the fall is the best time to do it, just because of vegetation.
Mhm.
Also because of poison ivy in some places. So, being very practical about this. Basically, what we wanted to do is to be able to see how much change has happened over a year.
Mhm.
And ideally, we would have people visiting that site, maybe not doing measurements every season or every month, but visiting the site and taking photographs so we can catch when most of that change has taken place. what we're seeing through some of this work is that storms are probably the biggest impactors, that we can have a site that will not change for several years, and then having a storm that comes from a particular orientation for that site. And perhaps two storms, one sort of softens it up, and then the next one really removes a lot of material. And so trying to understand what are the vulnerabilities for each specific site is part of this work. So an annual measurement and then photographs through the year are the ideal. And then also documenting things that are eroding out.
Yeah, wow, it sounds like a lot of work. Do you have enough volunteers, or is part of your public outreach to get more people to sign up to do this?
We would love to have more volunteers.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, we'll see if we can get you some from Belfast.
That
All
would
right,
be great.
let's, I have another question. Somebody asked, what is the oldest and the most recent midden, if you can tell from your research?
The oldest midden, one of the oldest anyway, is on North Haven Island, Turner Farm site. It's a pretty well-published site. There are old, and that dates to probably 4,000 to 6,000 years old. There are also old, there's an old one on Lazy Gut Island, as I understand it. I've never been to that one in particular, but I understand that one dates to probably 6,000 years old. Monhegan Island is another one that dates to this, 4,000 to 5,000 year time period. And so those are, a handful. We have, like I said, we have a handful of those older ones. And we also know that scallop draggers have brought up older materials from the ocean floor. And so these are remnants that have probably washed away. As far as the youngest site goes, I would say it's probably Malaga Island, and that is a mixed race fishing community there, who harvested shellfish there and created, and that was mid 1800s to I think 1912 when people were removed from that island. So I don't know, Alice, do you know of any younger than that? I think that's,
Yeah, that would probably be of people living and consuming material at one site. Anyone who's been in the Down East area, Look's Cannery had quite a shell midden out behind them where they were canning clams, but that's not quite the same thing. So.
All right, thank you. Chloe asks, is there evidence of freshwater mussel shells in the heaps?
I think we get mussels occasionally, but primarily no.
But not freshwater usually. I haven't.
Oh, no, not
not
freshwater.
freshwater. There are places in the interior of the US on big rivers that have shell heaps that are composed of freshwater mussels, but not that I know of in Maine.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Please either raise your hand or unmute yourself. There aren't any more in the chat. Anybody? Well, just to follow up on the volunteers, you gave the information, and the website is where people would go to learn more about the procedure for that.
Yep.
Okay, just clarifying that for everybody. Anybody else have a question? Last call. Tom, you unmuted yourself. Do you have something to say?
Thank you. Very, 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 very interesting.
Yes.
And I think you have made us all aware of something that, we weren't, and appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's very interesting talk. And certainly BBWC would be interested, I'm sure, working with you folks on what we can do in the Belfast Bay Area.
Well, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. I echo what he says, and thank you so much for the presentation and to BBWC, and have a great year.
Thank you for having us.
Enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.